Hello there, friends and family. I'm Island. I hold Jeff Donofrio.
And I'm Andy Proper Neckrich.
And this is the Defuse, your talk show post game recap of everything going on in the CDL. Of course, now focusing on what's happening in Toronto. Let's get this thing started, get the fuse lit, and start talking about match number one, Atlanta versus Minnesota. First one up, this one expectations wise. We were expecting this to be probably a 3-0, and we would not be disappointed, but it came with a little bit of drama as Minnesota off the rip on Ramaza were looking extremely strong and then would unfortunately choke the map one finish as Atlanta would come back, and then they wouldn't let off the gas past that point.
Yeah, Minnesota at the beginning of that entire Ramaza, they were finding so many good setups and they were finding the kills to get themselves on those money hills. It was definitely a spectacle to see. At the beginning of that, I was personally looking at all of this as to what the weapon loadouts were going to be for Atlanta. I'm sure you remember me talking about this as we were watching the games, Alan. And Sims started off with an M4 and then moved their way over towards an MP5. And once
Yeah,
they
that's
moved
true.
over to that MP5, they did not slow down by any means. They just found so much more value. Of course, Celium then that started off with an MP5, moved over towards an M4, and this is where the team really started to find their strides, and they punished Minnesota for all of their mistakes on the back half of Ramaza.
And really beyond that, there's not too many mistakes to really note for Minnesota because they never stood a chance at the search and destroy. That was a 6-1 tally. And then at the very end of the domination, there was a moment there on that gun run where Minnesota would have a chance to potentially neutral to try to keep it close in the final 60 seconds, but weren't able to do that either. So as far as this Minnesota Rocker team, we have kind of been, I would say, numbed to the point that they're going to find ways to not win maps. And that was indeed the case here early. But the disappointment just continues in a multitude of different ways for the Rocker, and I'm sure for the fans of the Rocker as well. This is a tough spot to be in. As the Minnesota Rocker, they can't fall out of where is the middle four right now, that 8th through 5th position when it comes to the overall standing. So they won't start their tournament in the losers bracket. But at this point, if this keeps up, I feel like a lot of people are going to expect to see them in the losers bracket pretty quickly when they get to that playoff.
I would agree with that too. I mean, they're not necessarily looking good against any team that they're facing. I mean, you had a lot of bright spots. Yes, Asim in that one round that they won on Search and Destroy Gunrunner absolutely popped off. Alex looked pretty strong throughout the
Yeah, he
day as
did.
well, closer to where we saw them prior to Exceed coming in because of that thumb injury that Alex was dealing with. But still, you have a lot of problems that Minnesota are facing ever since they came to online that they haven't really been able to focus up on. The most important one out of anything is that we're not seeing them win their 1v odd man gunfights as much as
Mm.
we did when we were previously on land.
That's very much the case. But on the opposite side, this is 100%, I think, a statement match for Atlanta. They come off that 0-3 loss most recently versus Chicago, and I think I put a lot of question marks over where in the top four do you put the Atlanta phase. They need to bounce back this weekend, you feel like, if they want to not only continue to be a top four team, but to potentially still lock in their number one spot in the playoffs. Now, granted, this was versus a Minnesota Rocker team, but in my mind, for them to come out and look as good as they did on Search and Destroy, to look as complete as they did, not just on the early stages of the domination, but also in that comeback effort on Ramaza, this is starting to feel more like the Atlanta phase of old when we simulated them with dominating search and destroys, convincing hard points, and good domination. In your mind, though, does this Atlanta phase team have enough from what you saw in this singular instance to potentially take the weekend and lock that number one spot in the playoffs?
I will say this much that previously to when they were facing Chicago at that specific home series, again, I'm going to keep bringing up this point, is that in that specific home series, that one was kind of a it's hard to tally that one up to Atlanta playing the game in full, given the meta, given the maps that they were playing. They were trying to feel out a lot of different rough corners towards their game to see where they truly stood strong. But if they're able to continue to play the game that we saw here today versus Minnesota, they look very comfortable. They look dominant in Atlanta phase's corner. I would say that this is probably the strongest that we've seen them
Hmm.
in quite some time.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think that, there's conversation about the meta change and all that kind of stuff, but this Atlanta team, we've talked about how we keep throwing them lifesavers, and this is exactly why when they come out and put out performances like this, well, that's to give you at least some sort of an idea of why we give them a little bit of maybe courtesy when it comes to them maybe not having the best weekends ever. Switching things
Sure.
over, though, a rematch between the Florida Mutineers and the Dallas Empire. We expected this one to be better than the first time, but I will say this much: we almost got treated to a reverse 3-0 as Dallas was able to hand the Mutineers a 3-0 the last time they played. Florida started off with a very convincing first two maps, but would come up short as the Dallas Empire actually find themselves a reverse sweep. to make sure the revenge is not being found. But just want to start with the first two maps from Florida, because when Florida is winning on a 250 to 127 score line without Awakening popping off, that right there gives me hope that this Florida team very well can win a championship in a couple of weeks.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Awakening not popping off, this is something that we talked about when they did get 3-0'd versus Dallas, and that was a very off game for members such as Awakening, Havoc, and Pharaoh. But Pharaoh, Frosty, and Havoc, they all played their roles wonderfully. They were popping off, 10mm rounds included. They looked in top-notch form, but then you could also go back and look at the 6-1 Arcloth peak that Florida also took over Dallas, and that's when Awakening was averaging 2 kills per round. Very impressive stuff from Florida in those opening two maps. They were quite literally running circles around Dallas. They looked a lot more comfortable on those two maps than they definitely did in their previous outing versus the Empire.
Yeah. And beyond that, the same thing can be said almost the opposite way, because they had the search and destroy immediately afterwards in Arcloth Peak, which, to be fair, Dallas is just okay at. But Awakening is able to find, 14 kills in that map alone, and Havoc is still running forward and finding a lot of pressure. This is a Florida Mutineers team that looked absolutely terrifying, and it was kind of one of those things that we heard from the Mutineers after the last home series, like, give us a little bit of time, let us learn this meta change back to what we kind of had from before. And while we thought that initially that was going to be the case, but this revenge run would be denied as the Dallas Empire find a way to get the reverse sweep. And well, the Dikembe Mutombo will say it best. No, 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 not today. Like that one.
Just for anybody that doesn't know, like, I don't know what these graphics are. This is my first time seeing this too. I don't know. I mean, I know what the talking points are going to be, considering I'm watching the games with this nut to my on the left hand side of your screen. But I'm no one can ever be strapped in for that. Well played, Shift. But yeah, Dallas Empire absolutely come back with the reverse sweep. Clay came out with a tweet as well saying they just couldn't shoot straight in those opening two maps, and the scoreline would definitely argue to say that, to say the least, is that they did not look comfortable beyond belief. For me personally, as Clay and Crim6 have been popping off with their double AR setup, they've been looking very comfortable in their previous outings, and that got shown in full through that domination all the way down into that map 5 where it got settled on St. Petrograd.
Yeah, and I will say this much, for a moment there, on that Hackney Yard domination, it was so strange because both teams played pretty immaculately from the C side of the map,
That's
where
right.
it was the CB hold, or at least a B neutral, being held off for the majority of the 6 minutes. We didn't really see much in terms of spawn flips from C to A. It was a lot of the game dictated by who was able to hold the CB setup longest, which is definitely strange. But these two teams have played each other so often on the Hackney Yard domination in specific. And now you're in a situation where the Florida Mutineers still have not actually won a single domination versus the Dallas Empire. That's my biggest takeaway, I still think, from this matchup in whole, as they are pretty 50-50 when it comes to the hard points and the searches. But domination is where Dallas has been giving Florida the biggest headache. And that's good news, I think, for Dallas overall, not just to make sure they can set themselves up for potential comebacks in the series as a whole, but when you're continually winning map number 3 versus other major opponents, you're going to be feeling a lot better about your chances taking away series in full as we get closer and closer to the playoffs. So good things there from Dallas to find the reverse sweep against Florida, to make sure that they weren't able to taste any of their own medicine that they were able to dish out from the weekend before. Going over to Chicago versus Seattle as our next matchup, this is another one that we expected to be pretty convincing in the favor of the Chicago Huntsmen. And we would not necessarily be surprised by the outcome, but it didn't really come in the fashion that I think many would have expected, as Seattle actually drew first blood in this series, taking a 250 to 201 Gunrunner hardpoint. And throughout that, and my only big storyline that I want to hit on first here proper, is I don't know if there is a single harder carry in the league than Octane. I'll even take that one step further and say there is no single harder carry than Octane, as he pulled over 30 kills, doing it in what was just around double positive KD fashion.
35 and 19 on that opening hardpoint on Gunrunner with 1:45 in the hill time. Led their team in KD and in hill time. The only person that was closer in hill time alone would be Pander at 1:26. As far as KD ratio, well, Apathy and Slack tied at 27-27. So yeah, I think that that is more than warranted. I think that has a certain stamp that you could definitely put on your refrigerator and write home about. And there is no harder carry in the entire league. Sam Octane, through multiple instances, we've seen it through a lot of different matches with the Seattle Surge. is always leading their team, whether it's in hardpoint, search and destroy. It doesn't matter. This AR player can always make a run for being one of the better ARs in the league because of this impressive stat line alone. You get kills and you turn them in your favor to where you thought it was a submachine gun earlier on in the season. Now we move over towards with the M4. It gives a little bit more oomph in towards that battle, and they're still able to turn those kills in their favor too. It's literally the only reason why, apart from maybe apathy, finding a lot of good openings in that search and destroy on Gunrunner, that this match was close.
And I would say for Seattle, they really showcased that there has been improvements that are being made. It's just not enough. I mean, you lose the round 11 versus Chicago, you get smoked in what is your best overall game mode in the domination. To be fair, it's not Chicago's worst by any stretch of the imagination. But then you also are able to take Chicago to a down to the wire essentially on the Petro. It's in the fashion at which they played that Petro, especially. It just seemed like they're still missing that second and third layer of how to play hardpoint, where that P4 near the end, they win the hardpoint initially, and they just bunker up inside of it. And even after they get a string of kills trying to defend that hill, they never zone it back out. So it allows Chicago another free attempt to essentially go for a break, in which they do successfully break through the final 20 seconds and then just win the game off the initial time for P5. Those are mistakes that can't be happening at this stage of the game. And overall, it definitely is showcasing that Seattle is obviously one of those teams that will be starting off in the bottom four for the playoffs, but your hopes really shouldn't be all that high. But on the other side, I want to take Chicago's negative side of view, because this one, in my opinion, was too close for comfort. Let's be completely candid here. These guys in total need to be closing out teams like Seattle much easier. And that's 2 for 2 right there in that topic image.
Is that a snuggie?
It's a snuggie, and she's sweating. It's comfort, but it's not fully comfort. You see, that's what we're going for.
You have a bright future in making gimpy photos. I tell you that much. But no, I agree. But you can also chalk this up that when we saw Chicago at their peak, aka when they 3-0'd Atlanta FaZe, that was when 10mm wasn't around, and you saw 3 ARs rather than 3 SMGs on the field. So we saw Persini back with the sub today, and definitely got punished more often than not. We talked about it. We were on that show together, Shift, when we talked about it. With Persini looked very good with an M4 in hand, because it's basically like a stake in the ground with a leash on a wild dog. They're able to reel himself back and can lock down a lot of rotations. But with a sub in hand for Persini, sometimes they get a little wily. Sometimes they go off on their own solo missions that are going to get punished by an AR, such as Sam Octane. And you got to be careful of that, because if you're always trying to find a lot of openings that, well, quite frankly, aren't always there, then you're going to get punished by stronger teams. And this is going to be a big woe for Chicago heading in towards champs and the rest of this weekend.
I think the big thing, when we compare these top teams right now, for me, it comes down to the conversation just very quickly here about the SMG line. When we think about the trio SMGs for teams like Atlanta and Dallas, I think a lot of people would say those names with more comfort than they would talk about the 3 SMGs that are currently on the lists for Chicago. Without Arcity's informal, is this Chicago team a top 4 squad? I think there would be a valid argument to combat that and say, no, they're not. We haven't really seen the same type of participation from the Chicago SMG line than we have from like Atlanta and Dallas in specific. And maybe you could even argue as of late, maybe even Florida. Now, that said, I'm not going to sit there and say that they're bad. It's just when you're looking at a championship roster, I feel like that's the comparison that was probably going to get hit at first, is when you're looking at the SMG lines, Chicago's doesn't really seem to fit in the conversation at the same level as what Atlanta and Dallas have been able to at least showcase throughout the year. So it's interesting to kind of keep that in mind, as we'll obviously be discussing that more as we get closer and closer to the playoffs. Going over to our final matchup of the day, though, this is going to be Toronto and OPTIC Gaming LA. This is one of those situations where both teams desperately needed the 10 points. And, at the same point, you're not out of the tournament if you lose this, but it definitely makes the ride a little bit easier if you win this matchup. And what was a great start for the Toronto Ultra ended up seeing things come down to a Game 5 near reverse sweep for OPTIC Gaming LA, where they would be turned aside in the St. Petro Search and Destroy.
Yeah, this was a very, very fun match. And I say very fun just because we got to watch this entire match with Visions, a Canadian local. So that was definitely fun to always poke.
He always makes those watch parties so much more fun when Toronto's playing.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost like watching a UFC fight with Austin. He's just always popping off at the right time. So always rooting for his team. But still, off of that Ramaza hard point, all the way down towards that search and destroy on Piccadilly. Yes, the scoreline would say that it was relatively close, especially for that search and destroy at 6-4. where Draza went 12-3 going into round number 6, dropping 17 kills. And
Unbelievable.
so did Cammy at the same time. Cammy with the sniper rifle today was a spectacle to watch for sure, but it was just really, really fun to watch in the manner that Toronto are definitely a team that you could definitely write home about, because this team for Toronto coming in closer and closer to champs, this is going to be the 5 I can only imagine that we are going to be looking at. They were 15-25 from launch weekend in towards the Chicago home series, but from the Florida home series and entering in Toronto, they're 22-23. So they're on the up and up. And I think for this home series included, I believe it was Merck and Maven that made this point. They could definitely make some damage here as they go up against Chicago tomorrow.
That's actually I'm glad that you brought that up. This is my next point here. Where you look at the Canadian team in full, did we see enough from here to sit there and say that these guys can potentially not just compete with the top teams, but in specific for this weekend, they essentially have to win this event in full to
Sure
get
do.
out of the bottom 4 for playoffs. So that said, did you see enough this weekend to truly believe that this Toronto team can actually make that happen?
Yes, I did. Absolutely. You saw a lot of bright spots and a lot of smart plays, specifically in the search and destroy, as I would expect from Toronto Ultra. I mean, whether it was Bance hiding behind a door on St. Petrograd, Classic being able to redeploy through the arches on that St. Petra as well, Cammy on Piccadilly, Kleenex on Piccadilly, but then you also go towards the hard points and how smart this team really showcased their abilities today. Yes, this is against an Optic LA team, and I'm sure we'll probably end up talking about whether this is a honeymoon phase or whatever for this Optic squad. They're going through their own payload of issues as it may be, but still
Right.
Toronto being able to read the room and being able to play out these situations wonderfully, whether that was playing for the rotation, playing for the breaks, playing for spawn traps. This team, again, I think with this 5 in tow, if they can play the same level that we saw today, can definitely make some waves.
My big concern is, I mean, I guess I'll stick the other side. I'll take the positive side of things this time around. For the Toronto team, here's the good news. You're in the winners bracket out of your group, where really now your biggest opponent is Chicago. And honestly, and I truly believe this, if Toronto plays at the same level they played today, with how shaky Chicago looked versus a very vulnerable Seattle team earlier, I can honestly see Toronto beating Chicago tomorrow and getting into the
I agree.
playoffs as the number 1 seed. But the problem is that's when all of the issues will start to rise, because you still have to go through the playoffs in which you're going to be surrounded by likely 3 of the top 4 teams in the current league, where you've got Atlanta, Florida, and Dallas. Only 2 of those 3 could get in. And then you don't really see a world where Optic is able to get past Chicago unless something is absolutely dramatic unfolding tomorrow. So that's the big thing about this Toronto team right now is, it's been great. You mentioned their record, out of how things have improved since they really brought Kleenex into the mix, but was it a weekend? Just one weekend too late. If they bring him in earlier, get an extra 10 or 20 points, now you're in the middle 4. And
Yeah.
now the outside part, you're sitting here hoping that you have to win a majorly stacked event just to get to that position. Otherwise, you're starting in the losers bracket, which is really unfortunate because this Toronto team is absolutely hitting its stride right now. But sometimes that's just the way it be.
Sometimes strides come a little bit later when you're down the raft, but I mean, when you have the roster that Toronto does, and you're playing around with all of these different parts, Looney, Kleenex, and then Cammy coming. There's just so much that you have to be playing around with, and I'm going to agree with you that maybe it took Toronto a little bit too long to find this final 5 that they are able to find such strides with. But now you're going to have to hope that you can continue to find strides, and you're going to have to play this same level again to not only run through Chicago tomorrow, but potentially seeing on Sunday, who are you going to end up seeing out of the mix?
Yeah.
It's going to only get tougher for them.
Well, it's one of those things that, as we have a natural segue here, we'll kind of rotate to talk about it. Of course, we have our normal elimination and early qualifier matchups to start the day tomorrow before we get to our last chance qualifiers. But before we start kind of framing up those matchups, again, just a reminder for you guys out there that we do take your viewer questions. And not only do we take them, but if we answer them, you actually will get 5 CMG credits. So go ahead right now. If you navigate over to the CMG Twitter at CMG_esports, you'll see the most recent tweet, which will call for questions. I believe exclamation point giveaway right now in the chat will also give you a direct link to that post. Feel free to submit a question, and if it's good, we read it off. You just get 5 credits just like that. A little bit of class participation going on right here, although this is not a class that I would want to be the teacher of. But talking about these
But you
teams
would
that
be.
are going, but I would be. I still would, even though I don't want to. I still would. This is like the what is that movie where what's her name? Jodie Foster is the teacher, the inner city kids. Do you know what I'm talking about? No. Oh, it's such a good movie. I'm actually so mad that I don't know this. I'm gonna look it up. But
I feel
while
like
we're
I would know
looking
the
that
film.
up,
I would know the film.
shoot. She's like a literature teacher, an English teacher or something, and yeah, it's a whole thing. It's a good thing. Regardless, what as we take a look at the teams and the matchups for tomorrow? Let's just start with the qualifier matchups first, because those are the ones that I think we're most interested in. We already kind of talked up Chicago, Toronto, but I still want to get your take. Who gets in off of that matchup?
I sat there, and as we were watching the match, you literally took the words right out of my mouth as we were talking. As you brought up this point, that if Toronto play the same level that they did today, they will beat Chicago. It'll probably go to 5, but I definitely have Toronto beating out Chicago tomorrow.
Wow. Okay, definitely. He says. Okay,
Yeah, for sure.
that's wild. I mean,
They're gonna punish Pristini. I think Pristini's gonna get too
definitely.
wily. They're gonna get
Oh
wily.
wow, that's bold. And the movie is called Freedom Writers. It's a great one from 2007. It's a really good one. So go watch that if you're into that. But I don't know if I can sit there and say definitely. I mean, Chicago right now is the number one hard point team in the game, the third best search team in the game, and the third best domination team in the game. And you're sitting here and telling me it's going to be definitely Toronto over Chicago?
I'm not gonna deny your stats. I'm not gonna deny your stats. Stat Lord 21 over here. But it's still at the same time. I'm looking at what we saw today. I'm looking at what we saw in previous weeks, and that stat line that you're reading off comparatively to Toronto's, although not the strongest comparatively, yes. What I saw in the previous weeks versus Chicago in this exact meta on this exact weekend with their home series in the back, I think Toronto takes this.
Let me just remind you that last time these two teams played, it was a slapping from Chicago. It was a 3-0 from Chicago.
What home
Granted,
series was that?
that was the Minnesota home series, so it was
Okay.
right before we got the meta change.
Okay. And who played for Toronto?
I can tell you here 1 second. That was before we had the medals and classic swap ups. So I think medals was playing.
And Kleenex
Classic
wasn't
was
in
out.
there either.
Kleenex was in there. He started playing when they
Did
jumped
Kleenex
in
play
from
in there?
Dallas. Yeah, Kleenex was
Okay.
playing.
All right.
I don't
But
know, man.
It's not this 5. It's not this 5.
Definitely is a really it's really really tough.
Eat your
I
heart
have a
out,
hard
Visions.
time
I'm
saying
rooting for you.
definitely.
Eat your heart out, Visions. I'm rooting
I've
for you,
got
man.
Chicago 3-2 in this one, but I still think that if Chicago comes up on a bad map set, that it could be the opposite way around. I think it really is going to come down to what the map picks and bans are going to look like.
Okay.
He's definitely wow. Okay, that's
Yeah.
wild. I don't understand how you could say that, but that's wild.
I'm
How
a
about this
bold
matchup
man,
though?
Shift. I'm a bold man.
I know you are. Atlanta and Dallas for playoffs. Who you got getting in?
Atlanta, Dallas. I think that Atlanta takes this. Atlanta came out of the gates just absolutely swinging. That you can't start slow tomorrow, Clayster, and you can't wait until map 3 to start heating up, because once you get to map 3 and you're in that dominations for versus Atlanta phase, that if we see Simp and Abizi popping off like we saw today, there's absolutely no way that you're going to be able to keep up with them. The Dallas Empire, especially for Hook, taking what was it about 3-4 maps before they started really showing up in the kill feed as well. You can't be that shaky versus Atlanta. Not this Atlanta that we saw today. Yes, it was against Minnesota. And take everything that I said earlier about Minnesota, sure, but Atlanta looked pretty damn polished, and they didn't need Celium to clutch up a multitude of fights to do it.
I'm right there with you. I've got Atlanta taking this one 3-1. Dallas has had a tough time, and by tough I mean nearly an impossible time taking a search and destroy or a domination from the Atlanta FaZe squad. The only mode of which they have matched up versus the Atlanta FaZe has been hardpoint. Outside of that, Atlanta has been really the only instance of kryptonite for the Dallas Empire, although I guess you could make an argument for Chicago as well, as they hold a 3-1 head-to-head advantage versus them. But I'm right there with you. I've got Atlanta taking that one 3-1. On the other front, though, now elimination matches, and I don't even know how to start with this one, because we've got Optic Gaming LA versus a Seattle team that, again, like I mentioned, I feel like is a little bit too one-dimensional at the moment, but obviously showcase that they still could compete kind of hand in toe with where Chicago is currently at. So who do you got in Seattle Optic?
I don't necessarily see Apathy having 2 pop-off days in a row. If Apathy does it, then that'd be fantastic. We know that Octane's going to put the entire team of Seattle Surge in their backpack. But Draza just dropped 17 kills in a loss on Piccadilly Search and Destroy. And then Hollow went big in that 5th map too. I think that this team, honestly, between Optic, yes, they lost to Toronto today, but I just don't see Seattle having the same bright spots in all 5 of their corners for their team right now, man. I mean,
Yeah.
Octane and Apathy, yes, I could sit there and tell you that they looked great today. But did Slack, Panda, and Proto be consistent throughout the entire day? Maybe a little more Proto than the rest of them, but no, it's just not impressive enough for me to sit there and tell you that Seattle will be able to, make it towards a qualification match. I definitely have Optic taking this. It might be close, it might not be. I can't honestly tell you with Seattle search. It could go to map 5. Who honestly knows? But Optic's going to take it.
I'm sitting here looking at this Optic Gaming LA team and thinking that there has to be some sort of at least mild regret about not picking up players sooner because Draza, like you mentioned, has been an absolute phenom since he was picked up. And I would say Hollow's
Yeah.
right there with him. He's been playing solid. He's been playing consistent. And if you would have had these guys 2-3 weeks before, okay, maybe you would have been in a position kind of like Toronto where you don't have to worry about going through an extraneous back part of the season in a very difficult home series just to get out of the bottom 4, which of course Optic Gaming is still under a threat of. I think unless they make the playoffs, I think they have a shot at getting in, but they will for sure make it through if they make it to another grand finals, which I
Shift
think now that
Hollow
they're in the
win
losers.
34 and 25 on that Hackney Yard, man.
I know he's nasty, dude. I mean, the kids, both those kids are absolutely insane. Other side, Minnesota plays Florida, 3-0 Florida. I don't think anyone's going to say anything other than that.
Unless the team somehow finds a way to go absolutely Super Saiyan
Can't see it
God mode.
happen.
I don't necessarily see it happening either. I mean, there is a small glimmer of hope maybe that you take a map off of Florida, but Florida's definitely taking this over Minnesota. I don't think anybody's going to be questioning about that.
Right there with you. So let's go over to our viewer questions segment. We got a couple of good ones here. We'll start off with Ioto24. He asked the question, do you think that the last event when we saw FaZe and Huntsman could be possibly considered as an outlier since the fact remained that it was a different meta altogether with most of the 4 ARs? And do you think that with the 10mm back, it helps FaZe significantly more than teams like Huntsman? I think absolutely yes. I think that FaZe, they were in a weird spot. I think we saw on social media that was the case. They were trying to use the AUG, the Uzi, things were getting GA'd last minute. And that weekend, the New York home series was one that I feel like they were not necessarily as prepared as they needed to be. And even the one following up where they had not really a lot of time to kind of get back into their mojo and get into the swing of things where, okay, now we have to play with this. I still think they were kind of getting their bearings back on. But now that they've had a couple of weeks, I think that this meta is absolutely more favorable for a team like the Atlanta FaZe than it is a team like Chicago Huntsmen. Not only because we talked about how Chicago could get a little bit too loose with how they play, but I think overall, when you take a look at players like a BZ and Sip, you put in a little bit of extra power in the SMG, and they'll find a way to frag with it.
I brought up most of those points that'll answer this question earlier on in this show. Yeah, it's absolutely an outlier. The meta was not favorable for them the last time that they faced. Absolutely. They did not necessarily play in their comfort zone as far as maps are concerned. But Atlanta FaZe, they're coming out of the gates. They're coming out swinging. They want that first place that badly. 10mm rounds. I'm going to agree with Schiff that this is absolutely their meta to be playing with. I mean, you saw it happen on that opening hardpoint today. It was Simp that started off with an M4. Celium wasn't finding the value in it. So what do? They literally swapped roles, it seems. I mean, Simp was still roaming and finding a lot of eliminations, a lot of influential 1v3s at time. But still, when you went over towards that MP5, Simp just absolutely frolicked. They looked in top shape as well. My biggest concern is if not Priesthood can play at this level as well, is something that we've been kind of noting at as far as Atlanta FaZe is concerned through their previous matchups, and especially that one versus Chicago Huntsmen. But I would still sit here and tell you that it's an absolute outlier. That 10mm coming back definitely favors Atlanta FaZe.
Yeah, right there with you. Another good question here, just to kind of close things out here for us, from Samia Creates asks, which team is a dark horse heading into champs? Who do you kind of got your eye on to potentially surprise come playoffs if it were to happen today proper?
If it were to happen today, my dark horse,
Yeah.
I almost said that. Jay Pistachio said Toronto. I would definitely say that New York isn't even really considered to be a dark horse. I mean, they're a real threat. I would definitely say that for sure. I would probably say the London Royal Ravens, to be completely honest with you.
That's my
That
answer.
If the Ravens are somehow able to fix some of their woes and being shaky, and it's not necessarily always one player that's carrying a single map. If Weskin doesn't have to carry every single search, if Scraps doesn't have to drop 16 kills in a single search and destroy, and they can somehow get the rotations on all hard points, not just the construction man Shani on Ramaza, then I think that this team could absolutely make some punishment come towards a lot of different teams and champs.
I want to say the Toronto Ultra as well, but only if they find a way to get into the middle 4. I don't think that there's any way that they win or even make a big move through playoffs starting in the losers bracket. If they can get into the middle four, it puts them in what? Probably the 8th position. There's really no way they can catch up to Minnesota. So you figure that it should be Paris, I think, playing up against the New York Subliners. That's a matchup that I like. But the
Yeah.
problem is, can you get to that point? I just don't think that they're going to have the legs to win a championship this weekend, which I believe is what they're going to need, because for Toronto, they do not hold the head-to-head tiebreaker versus the Paris Legion. So even though right now they're at 80 points, another 20 of just getting to grand finals won't be enough. They'll have to completely win out this. And then maybe they actually would surpass the Minnesota Rocker, as they technically would be 1-1 at a 4-4 map differential between them. So there's actually potential that Toronto wouldn't just be in 8th. They very well could be in 7th. I'm not sure how the third level of that head-to-head tiebreaker would go. And if they do finish in 7th, then they'd play up against the London Royal Ravens, which is a matchup that I really like Toronto in. But I don't think that's going to happen. And because of that, I think that out of the middle 4 teams, the best one to actually be a dark horse and surprise people, I think the London Royal Ravens is that team that could potentially do it. Scraps has been playing absolutely lights out over the last couple of weeks, and this is a meta that if London can get their front line together and hit something together, for God's sake, they might actually start taking a handful of these respawns, including dominations, which is where they're weakest.
Wow. Someone put a pin in it. There was only one thing that we disagreed on today in this episode of the View Shift, and
It's weird, dude.
it's
That's wild.
It's a very weird. I think the stars are aligning. I think we're about to reach a harmonic convergence, and something weird's about to be happening.
Something weird already did happen at the very top of the show before we actually went live. We'll save that for our personal records and not for anything that we'll be putting out publicly.
It was weird.
It was very weird.
was
We've
weird.
never done anything quite like that before, and I don't know if we'll ever do anything like that again. But if those of you that are curious, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to miss out about it. But what you don't
Maybe
have to
we
miss
will.
out on is tomorrow's episode, which we'll be back with as soon as the YouTube stream goes down, at least as soon as possible. It does take a while to get all these edits and assets put together for you guys. But until then, friends and family, we say farewell. And until next time, make sure that fuse does not fizzle out. So long.